There is a seed that contains more fiber than black beans, more protein than almonds, and enough calcium to rival milk. It grows in soil too poor for corn. It survives droughts that kill soybeans, and for 4,000 years it fed more people than wheat and rice combined. Then in 1980 it vanished, not because it failed, because it succeeded too well. A crop that requires no fertilizer, no pesticides, and costs almost nothing to grow cannot generate profit. And what cannot generate profit cannot survive in modern agriculture. This is the story of the seed that built civilizations, survived the collapse of empires, and still grows wild in ditches across 43 countries. Before we crack this vault open, if these forgotten stories matter to you, the best way to keep this knowledge alive is simple. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this with anyone who needs to remember what we were never supposed to forget. The archive opens in the highlands of Peru, 1532. Francisco Pizarro and his conquistadors march into the Incan Empire. They expect gold. They find fields, endless terraces carved into mountains, growing a grain the Spanish have never seen. The terraces are engineering marvels, stone walls built without mortar, fitted so precisely that centuries later you cannot slide a knife blade between the blocks. Each terrace captures rainwater, prevents erosion, creates microclimates. The Incas built them over generations, moving millions of tons of earth and stone by hand. Some terraces climb 3,000 vertical feet up mountainsides, and on every level, quinoa. The Incas call it Chisimama, mother of all grains. The conquistadors call it food for Indians. They force the Incas to rip it out and plant wheat and barley instead, European crops that fail at high altitude. Millions starve, but the seed survives, hidden in small plots, in forgotten valleys, in the hands of those who refuse to forget. This is quinoa, Chenopodium quinoa, the seed that should have fed the world. 5,000 years before Pizarro arrived, quinoa was already ancient. Archaeologists digging near Lake Titicaca, 12,500 feet above sea level, found quinoa seeds in graves dated to 3000 BC. The plant grew where nothing else could: cold nights that freeze corn, thin air that starves wheat, soil so poor it looks like gravel. Quinoa thrived. The Incas understood what we forgot. They called it the mother grain, not because it was gentle, but because it gave life where death was expected. They bred hundreds of varieties: white quinoa for the coast, red quinoa for the mountains, black quinoa for the highest peaks, each one adapted to its landscape, each one designed to survive what killed everything else. The nutritional profile was unmatched: 14% protein by weight, more than wheat, more than rice, more than corn. But the protein was complete. It contained all 9 essential amino acids: lysine, which grains lack; methionine, which beans lack. Eat quinoa alone, and your body gets everything it needs to build muscle, repair tissue, and sustain life. The Incas knew this. They fed it to their armies. Soldiers marched for days on quinoa alone, crossing mountains, conquering lands. They called it the marching grain. Spanish chroniclers recorded that Incan runners carried quinoa in pouches, eating handfuls raw as they ran hundreds of miles, delivering messages across the empire. These chasqui, the messenger runners of the Inca, could cover 150 miles in a single day on nothing but quinoa and water. The Spanish could not believe it. Their own soldiers, fed on wheat bread and salted meat, could barely manage 20 miles before exhaustion set in. The fiber content was staggering: 5 grams per cup when cooked, more than oatmeal, more than brown rice, double what white rice provides. And it was soluble fiber, the kind that slows digestion, stabilizes blood sugar, and feeds beneficial bacteria in the gut. The Incas did not know the science. They knew the result. Eat quinoa and hunger stays away longer. Energy lasts. Strength endures. But quinoa was more than food. It was sacred. Every spring, the Incan emperor himself planted the first quinoa seed using a golden spade. Priests blessed the fields. Festivals celebrated the harvest. The grain was woven into the fabric of existence. To destroy quinoa was to destroy identity. The Spanish understood this, so they did it deliberately. In 1565, the Spanish crown banned quinoa cultivation. The reason given was religious. Quinoa was used in pagan rituals. The real reason was control. Quinoa allowed independence. A farmer could plant quinoa on a rocky hillside and feed his family for a year without buying anything, without paying taxes, without needing the colonial system. Wheat required fertile valleys, irrigation, and mills controlled by the Spanish. Wheat created dependence. Quinoa created freedom. So quinoa had to go. For 3 centuries, quinoa survived in secret. Indigenous families in the Andes kept seeds hidden. They planted small plots far from Spanish eyes. They ate it quietly, never selling it in markets, never speaking of it to outsiders. The knowledge passed from grandmother to granddaughter, from father to son. How to plant after the rains, how to harvest before the frost, how to wash away the bitter saponins coating the seeds. The washing itself was a ritual. Women would take the harvested seeds to streams and rub them between their hands for hours, letting the water carry away the foam until the bitterness was gone. The saponins are a defense mechanism, evolved over millions of years to protect the seeds from being eaten. They taste terrible. They irritate the gut. They make birds sick. But they also make quinoa nearly pest-free. No need for insecticides, no need for chemical treatments, just water and patience. This knowledge, simple but essential, was what kept quinoa edible. Without it, the crop was useless. The Spanish tried to erase it. But you cannot erase what people need to survive. By 1800, South America was breaking free from colonial rule. But quinoa remained invisible. The new republics, Bolivia and Peru and Ecuador, were run by European-descended elites who despised indigenous crops. They associated quinoa with poverty, with backwardness, with the people they wanted to forget. They imported wheat from North America and rice from Asia. They built their cities on European models, ate European food, and taught their children that civilization came from across the ocean. Quinoa was left to the highlands, to the indigenous Quechua and Aymara people who never stopped planting it. In 1950, those people were still eating quinoa every day. But in the cities, in Lima and La Paz, no one touched it. It was Indian food, peasant food, invisible. Then science arrived. In 1968, researchers at the National Academy of Sciences in the United States published a report. They had been searching for crops that could grow in harsh conditions to fight global hunger. They tested hundreds of plants. Quinoa stunned them. It grew at altitudes up to 13,000 feet. It tolerated frost down to -8 degrees Celsius. It survived on rainfall as low as 200 millimeters per year, half what wheat needs. And the nutritional content was extraordinary. They ran the protein analysis 3 times, thinking it was an error. 14% protein with a biological value of 73, higher than wheat at 60, higher than corn at 44. The only common food with a higher biological value was milk. They published the findings. Quinoa, they wrote, could be one of the most important crops for feeding humanity in the 21st century. No one listened. The 1970s arrived. The Green Revolution was in full swing. High-yield wheat and rice were being shipped to developing countries. Fertilizers, pesticides, irrigation systems. The solution to hunger, they said, was industrial agriculture. Quinoa did not fit. It was a small-scale crop grown by subsistence farmers using methods unchanged for millennia. There were no chemical companies invested in it, no seed corporations breeding proprietary varieties, no machinery designed to harvest it. It was outside the system, so it stayed outside the conversation. But something was happening in the Andes. population was growing. Young people were leaving for the cities. The old farmers who knew quinoa were dying. By 1980, quinoa production was collapsing. In Bolivia, production dropped 40% in a single decade. The younger generation did not want to farm. They wanted jobs in mines, in factories, in cities. They wanted money. Quinoa did not provide that. You could not sell it because no one wanted to buy it. The urban markets wanted rice and pasta and bread. Quinoa was worthless. Farmers began plowing under their quinoa fields to plant potatoes or barley, crops they could at least sell for something. The old terraces, built by Incan engineers centuries before, began to crumble from neglect. Then the health food movement in North America discovered it. In 1982, a small natural foods company in Boulder, Colorado, imported the first commercial shipment of quinoa from Bolivia. They sold it in Whole Food stores as an ancient superfood. The price was high. Few people bought it, but word spread slowly among vegetarians and athletes. Here was a plant-based protein source that was complete, that required no processing, that tasted mild and cooked fast. By 1985, demand was growing. Not exploding, but growing. Bolivian farmers who had been abandoning their fields started planting again. The price per kilogram doubled, then tripled. For the first time in centuries, quinoa was profitable. But the boom was just beginning. In 1993, NASA published a report. They were researching crops for long-duration space missions. Quinoa was ideal, high nutrition, low input, adaptable to controlled environments. They called it a candidate crop for the Controlled Ecological Life Support System. The media picked it up. Quinoa, the space food. The seed astronauts would eat on the way to Mars. Sales spiked. By 2000, quinoa was in mainstream supermarkets across the United States and Europe. Cookbooks featured it. Chefs experimented with it. Nutritionists recommended it. The price kept rising. In Bolivia, quinoa farmers were suddenly wealthy by local standards. They bought trucks, sent their children to university, built larger houses. The land where quinoa grew, the dry altiplano around Lake Titicaca, had always been the poorest region in South America. Now it was booming. But there was a dark side. As quinoa prices soared, the people who grew it could no longer afford to eat it. By 2010, quinoa cost more per kilogram than chicken in Bolivia. Families who had eaten quinoa every day for generations switched to cheap rice and pasta imported from abroad. Child malnutrition rates in quinoa-growing regions increased. The crop that had sustained them for 5,000 years was now too valuable to consume. It was exported to wealthy countries while the farmers ate processed food that made them sick. The irony was brutal. Quinoa farmers were sending their traditional food to Los Angeles and London while feeding their own children white bread and instant noodles. Doctors in rural clinics began seeing diseases they had never seen before. Childhood obesity, type 2 diabetes in teenagers, vitamin deficiencies despite living in regions that grew the most nutritious grain on Earth. The pattern repeated. Indigenous crops become trendy in the West, prices explode, and the people who preserved them lose access. It happened with quinoa, it happened with chia, it happened with maca. Then, in 2013, the United Nations declared it the International Year of Quinoa. The goal was to promote quinoa as a solution to global hunger and malnutrition. Conferences were held, reports were published. Governments in Africa and Asia started pilot programs to grow quinoa locally. India planted it in the Himalayas. Kenya tested it in arid regions. China grew it in the Tibetan Plateau. The plant adapted. It grew. Yields were lower than in South America, but it worked. Quinoa could be grown almost anywhere with cool nights and dry conditions. The monopoly the Andes had held for 5,000 years was breaking. But something else broke. By 2015, the quinoa boom was over. Prices crashed. Farmers who had expanded production were left with warehouses full of unsold grain. The market had been flooded. Peru and Bolivia were competing with each other, driving prices down. And new producers in North America were entering the market: Colorado, Washington, Canada. They grew quinoa using industrial methods, large machinery, and monoculture fields. The yields were higher. The costs were lower. Andean farmers could not compete. By 2018, thousands of them had abandoned quinoa again. They went back to raising llamas, or they left for the cities. The quinoa that remained was often grown for export, not for local consumption. Some farmers went bankrupt. They had taken loans to buy tractors and equipment, betting on high prices that never returned. The banks foreclosed. Land that had been in families for generations was sold to pay debts. Others held on, returning to subsistence farming, growing just enough to eat and selling the rest when they could. The cycle had turned full circle. Let us go back to the question: why did quinoa disappear from diets in 1980? It did not disappear. It was never there. Outside the Andes, quinoa had been erased for centuries. Inside the Andes, it survived, but only barely, kept alive by indigenous farmers who had no other choice. In 1980, those farmers were abandoning it because it had no economic value. It was nutritionally superior to almost every grain on earth, but that did not matter. Nutrition does not determine what people eat. Economics does. Culture does. Power does. Quinoa was associated with poverty and with indigeneity, with a past that the modern world wanted to forget. Only when Western consumers decided it was valuable did it return. But it returned as a commodity, not as a staple. It was expensive, exotic, something you ate in salads at trendy restaurants, not something that fed families every day. The nutritional data is worth revisiting. 1 cup of cooked quinoa, 185 grams, 222 calories, 8 grams of protein, 5 grams of fiber, 15% of your daily iron, 30% of your magnesium, manganese at 58%, phosphorus at 28%, folate, copper, zinc. And the protein is complete. This matters. Most plant proteins are incomplete. Rice is low in lysine, beans are low in methionine. The mineral profile compounds the advantage. Quinoa contains more calcium than dairy milk, gram for gram, more iron than beef, more potassium than bananas. Magnesium levels rival those in almonds, but without the calories. The minerals are bioavailable, meaning your body can actually absorb them, unlike the minerals in grains that bind to phytic acid and pass through undigested. You have to combine them to get all 9 essential amino acids. Quinoa gives you all 9 in one seed. For vegetarians, for vegans, for anyone avoiding animal products, this is rare. The only other common plant foods with complete protein are soy, chia, and hemp. Quinoa tastes better than all of them. And the fiber, 5 grams per cup. The recommended daily intake is 25 grams for women, 38 for men. Most people get 15. 1 cup of quinoa gives you a third of what you need. The fiber is mostly insoluble. It does not dissolve in water. It moves through your digestive system, adding bulk, speeding transit time, preventing constipation. But some of it is soluble. That fraction feeds your gut bacteria. They ferment it and produce short-chain fatty acids, butyrate, propionate, acetate. These molecules reduce inflammation, improve insulin sensitivity, and may prevent colon cancer. Studies in the 2000s showed that people who ate quinoa regularly had lower rates of type 2 diabetes and heart disease. Not because quinoa is magic, because it is food, real food. The kind that does what food is supposed to do. Compare it to white rice, 1 cup cooked, 205 calories, 4 grams of protein, 0.6 grams of fiber, almost no vitamins, almost no minerals. White rice is energy and nothing else. It spikes your blood sugar. It leaves you hungry an hour later. It does not build muscle. It does not feed bacteria. It just keeps you alive. Quinoa keeps you thriving. Yet white rice feeds half the planet. Why? Because it is cheap. Because it grows in warm, wet climates where most people live. Because it stores for years without spoiling. Because colonial powers spread it across Asia, Africa, and Latin America as a cash crop. Because the infrastructure to grow, mill, and distribute rice has existed for centuries. Quinoa has none of that. It grows in cold, dry mountains. It spoils faster. It costs more. And until recently, no one outside the Andes knew how to cook it. That changed with the internet. By 2005, recipes for quinoa were everywhere. Food bloggers called it a superfood. Fitness influencers ate it before workouts. Parents fed it to toddlers. The instructions were simple. Rinse the seeds to remove the bitter saponin coating. Boil 2 parts water to 1 part quinoa. Simmer for 15 minutes. Fluff with a fork. Done. It tasted mild, slightly nutty, with a texture like couscous. You could eat it plain, or mix it with vegetables, or use it in place of rice. It was versatile, easy, fast, everything modern consumers wanted. But there was a problem no one talked about. Quinoa requires specific conditions to grow: cool nights, dry air, poor soil. These conditions exist naturally in the Andes, at high altitude where the air is thin and the temperature drops sharply after sunset. They do not exist in most of the world. Attempts to grow quinoa at low altitudes in warm, humid climates failed. The plants grew tall and leafy, but produced almost no seed. The day length was wrong. Quinoa is photoperiod sensitive. It needs short days to flower. In the tropics, day length does not change enough. In temperate zones, short days come with cold weather that kills the plant before it matures. Breeders worked for decades to develop day-neutral varieties that could grow anywhere. By 2010, they succeeded. New varieties grew in Washington state, in Canada, in Europe. But the yields were inconsistent. The seed quality varied, and the cost of production was higher than in Bolivia or Peru, where quinoa had been grown for thousands of years on land that cost almost nothing. Industrial agriculture tried to take over. Large farms in the United States planted hundreds of acres of quinoa using the same methods they used for wheat: tractors, combines, chemical herbicides. It worked, but barely. Quinoa seeds are tiny. They fall off the plant easily. Harvesting with a combine meant losing 20 to 30% of the crop. The seeds that made it to the truck were often damaged. And quinoa has natural pest resistance because of the saponins, bitter compounds in the seed coat that repel insects and birds. Breeding saponin-free varieties made them easier to eat, but also made them vulnerable. Suddenly, you needed pesticides. The advantage was gone. By 2020, quinoa was everywhere and nowhere. You could buy it in any supermarket, but most people did not. It was expensive. A pound of quinoa cost 4 times what a pound of rice cost. For families on a budget, the choice was obvious. And quinoa had a reputation problem. It was associated with wealthy, health-obsessed consumers who could afford to pay extra for superfoods. It was trendy. Trendy things go out of fashion. Quinoa became a punchline. The grain yuppies ate while pretending to care about indigenous people. The criticism was not entirely fair, but it was not entirely wrong either. The real question is not why quinoa disappeared in 1980. It is why it took until the 21st century to reappear. The nutritional superiority was known. The adaptability was proven. The potential to fight hunger in marginal lands was recognized by scientists in the 1960s. But none of that mattered because quinoa did not fit the system. It was not a commodity crop. There were no multinational corporations invested in it. There were no subsidies, no infrastructure, no political will. The global food system runs on standardization. Crops that can be planted with GPS-guided tractors, sprayed with chemicals from airplanes, harvested by combines the size of houses. Crops that produce uniform seeds that can be sorted, graded, packaged, and shipped in container ships. Quinoa, grown on steep terraces by hand, harvested with sickles, threshed by beating, is the opposite of this system. It cannot be industrialized without destroying what makes it valuable. It was just a seed grown by poor indigenous farmers in a part of the world no one cared about. Only when wealthy consumers in rich countries decided they wanted it did quinoa become valuable. And even then, it became a niche product, not a staple. The lesson is clear. Nutritional value does not determine what we eat. Power does. The crops that feed the world are the crops that generate profit for those who control the food system. Wheat, rice, corn, soybeans. These four crops provide more than half of all human calories, not because they are the most nutritious, because they are the most profitable. They can be grown on an industrial scale, harvested by machine, stored for months, shipped across oceans, and sold at a markup. Quinoa cannot. Not yet. Maybe never. But quinoa teaches us something industrial crops cannot. Resilience. For 5,000 years, it fed people in one of the harshest environments on Earth. It survived conquest, colonization, suppression, and neglect. It survived because the people who needed it refused to let it die. They saved the seeds. They planted them in secret. They passed the knowledge down. When the world finally noticed, quinoa was ready. It had been ready all along. Climate change is coming. The crops feeding 8 billion people were bred for stable conditions. Those conditions are ending. Droughts are longer. Heat waves are hotter. Rainfall is erratic. Wheat fails at 35 degrees Celsius. Corn needs consistent water. Rice requires flooded fields. Quinoa tolerates frost, drought, and poor soil. It grows where the industrial crops cannot. As the planet warms, as farmland degrades, as water becomes scarce, quinoa will matter again. Not as a trendy superfood, as survival. The projections are stark. By 2050, wheat yields in tropical regions could drop by 20%. Corn yields could fall by 30%. Rice paddies in Southeast Asia are already seeing saltwater intrusion from rising seas. The crops that feed billions are vulnerable. Quinoa is not. It has already proven it can survive what kills everything else. The seeds are already spreading. Farmers in the Himalayas grow quinoa at 14,000 feet. Farmers in Morocco grow it in the desert. Farmers in Sweden grow it at 60 degrees north latitude. The plant adapts. It always has. Indigenous farmers in the Andes bred hundreds of varieties over millennia, each one suited to a specific microclimate, a specific altitude, a specific soil type. Some varieties mature in 90 days, others take 180. Some have pink seeds, others are orange, red, purple, white, black. The diversity is not decorative, it is functional. Each color represents a different combination of antioxidants, each variety a different strategy for survival. Modern breeders are doing the same thing, faster. They are creating varieties that grow in heat, in humidity, in regions quinoa has never seen. The genetic diversity is enormous. There are more than 3,000 traditional varieties stored in seed banks. Each one holds traits that might be needed in a future we cannot predict. Drought tolerance, heat resistance, faster maturation, higher yields. The answers are in the genes, waiting. But seed banks are not enough. Seeds die in storage. They lose viability. The only way to keep a crop alive is to keep growing it. That requires farmers, small farmers, the kind who save seeds, who know their land, who adapt their practices year by year. These are the people who kept quinoa alive when no one else cared. They are still doing it, in Bolivia, in Peru, and in Ecuador. It returned because those same people never stopped fighting. The seed that survived conquest and suppression is still here, still growing, still feeding those who need it most. If this vault opened something for you, subscribe and hit the bell. Every like and every share preserves the knowledge they tried to erase. The next vault opens soon,